So it looks like South Korea is successful. What does all this tell you about that picture that we should understand?
And it also means that Korea can kind of be a bellwether for what's going on in other places. So we need to be watching what South Korea does to grapple with these sorts of things in order to adapt elsewhere around the world as well.
South Korea is an Asian engine, one can argue, isn't it?
And how significant is this result?
Of course, this is hugely significant because it is hopefully marking a new chapter for South Korea.
안녕하세요, 원다입니다. 미국 CNN, MBC, 호주 ABC, 영국 BBC, 프랑스의 프랑스24, 독일의 DW 뉴스, 캐나다의 CBC 뉴스 등 세계의 눈이 한국을 향해 집중하며 한국이 어떤 대응을 하는지 주의 깊게 지켜보는 건 어제 오늘 일이 아닌데요. 경제적 강국뿐만 아니라 문화 강국으로 그리고 군사 강국으로 더욱 우뚝 선 오늘날의 한국이기에 전 세계의 한국에 대한 분석과 관심은 더욱 치밀하고 깊어진 느낌입니다. 지난주에 치러진 이번 대선은 한국만의 정치 이벤트가 아니라 민주주의 회복의 시험대이자 동북아 정세를 다시 짜는 분수령이라는 점에서 더욱 관심이 집중됐었는데요. 세계 각국의 방송들은 이번 선거 결과가 민주주의 제도의 복원을 향한 국민적 결단이었다는 점을 특히 강조했죠. 또한 새로운 정부를 맞이한 한국이 앞으로 풀어나가야 할 문제점들을 깊이 있게 들여다보며 한국이 이를 어떻게 대응하고 해결해 나가는지를 보면서 그들의 미래지표로 사용하자고 말합니다.
This week, South Koreans elected a new president, Lee Jae-myung.
It feels really like a dramatic reversal of fortunes for Lee Jae-myung. So who is he? Well, he really jumped onto the international radar when he filmed himself, live streamed himself, climbing over the walls of Parliament to sneak in and vote down the imposition of martial law that was imposed on Korea 6 months ago, almost to the day. He was encouraging people in Korea to get out onto the streets and to protect their right to vote, and they did, and they voted him in to become the president. A high turnout, and he's got elected with almost 50% of the vote. They view this as a victory for democracy in the face of martial law.
South Korea is an Asian engine, one can argue, isn't it?
Post-war miracle.
This election is all about drawing a line following the political uncertainty we've seen in South Korea over the past 6 months or so.
Yeah, South Korea for the last 6 months, and also coinciding with the first 6 months of Donald Trump's term in the U.S., right, and the chaos that has engendered across for many people looking around across the world. This election has been seen as a referendum on the disastrous administration that preceded it. The former president basically was ousted, was impeached in April, but before that, back in December, had declared martial law. Perhaps the most disastrous thing a president could do in the context of South Korea, because that declaration itself, aside from drawing, armed soldiers to the doors of parliament, also triggered very, very dark memories of one of the darkest episodes in South Korea's modern history. The literally sort of the dictatorship and the uprisings of the 1980s, which was only ended really relatively recently, 1987, when you had the first sort of democratic elections in the country's modern history. Like I said, it was seen as a referendum. It wasn't really this inspiring agenda that led this, highest turnout in nearly 3 decades of Koreans to go rushing to the polls to vote in this election. It was really desperation to draw a line under the turmoil of the past, which is not to say that Korea is united. Far from it. It's a very sorely polarized, cliched word, but very true in South Korea's case. Very, very polarized, very, very divided between generations, ideologically as well, young and old.
And how significant is this result?
Of course, this is hugely significant because it is hopefully marking a new chapter for South Korea after months now of political turmoil. It's in fact exactly 6 months since the Conservative leader, now impeached President Yoon Song-yeol, made that late-night declaration of martial law. And people might remember seeing lawmakers here in South Korea hurry through to the National Assembly to vote to block that declaration. Lee Jae-myung was among them. He in fact live streamed himself climbing over the fence into the National Assembly.
What are going to be some of the top priorities for the new leader?
Well, certainly the first thing will be addressing the wounds, the deep divisions that have become evident throughout this saga. It's very polarised here in South Korea. There is this political polarisation that's going on here, and people, this has dredged up memories of the authoritarian past of South Korea. So Lee Jae-myung will have some work to do in really uniting the country, trying working to navigate some of those political divisions while, of course, Yoon Song-yeol's trial for insurrection continues, because he is still facing charges of both insurrection and abuse of power. But, this really has been seen as a referendum on Yoon and his party, and nearly 80% of eligible voters turned out, which is the highest rate in nearly 30 years. So a really emphatic participation rate there. The other big thing will be addressing the economy. Everyone we've spoken to after they've spoken about the martial law has said they're concerned about the economy. So be straight into business with a lot of urgent work to do.
Voter turnout has been very high, around 76%, to choose a new president and possibly wind down months of political turmoil in South Korea.
This, of course, as you just mentioned, it comes after this turmoil in the country. Tell us more detail there about how we got to this point.
It was exactly 6 months ago to the day that Yoon Suk-yeol made that brief and disastrous bid for martial law when the army stormed the National Assembly building. And outrage in South Korea against Yoon and his party has been overwhelming ever since. And he was already a very unpopular leader. Yoon was impeached by Parliament. Then in April, the courts barred him from office. And remember the video that went viral the night the army took control of the politician who was scaling the wall of the Parliament to get back inside to vote down Yoon's martial law? That was Lee Jae-myung.
What kind of challenges will a new leader here in South Korea face?
With his party's majority, he could actually be in a better position to negotiate with the Trump administration over tariffs and security arrangements. But on the domestic side, he's going to struggle with all the other challenges facing South Korea, including the economy, which is sputtering, and political polarization that is so deep.
This is a very unique election because Lee takes office within 12 hours of being declared the victor, and these problems are not going to wait any longer. So it's going to be difficult. He's going to have to essentially fix the plane while flying it midair.
But he has one thing going for him. For the first time in a long time, his party now has control of both the legislature and the presidency. That's control. So, yes, quite possibly, the hardest job Lee Jae-myung has ever had starts now. But nobody knows where this story is going to go next.
미국 CNN은 지난 6월 8일 한국의 대선에서 나타난 젊은 세대의 양극화 현상과 갈등을 보도하며 이것이 전 세계적인 현상이긴 하지만 한국에서 더욱 도드라지고 깊어진 이유에 대해 분석하는데요. 특히 다른 나라의 미래를 위한 지표로 삼기 위해 한국이 이를 어떻게 대응하는지 주의 깊게 지켜보자고 말합니다.
6 months ago, South Korea's then president declared martial law in a power grab that plunged the nation into chaos. This week, South Koreans elected a new president, Lee Jae-myung. A key battle in the election was drawn along gender lines. According to one exit poll, around 60% of women in their 20s and 30s voted for Lee, a liberal, while a majority of men in the same age bracket voted for the more conservative candidates. What makes South Korea so divided along gender lines? First, give us a sense of this new president.
During the last presidential election in 2022, when he lost by less than 1% of a point to Yoon Suk-yeol, the president who was impeached, he rose to the national attention because of his promotion of a universal basic income. He paid a lot of attention to social issues, particularly women's issues, gender issues. What was remarkable that is since the martial law declaration and the political crisis of the past 6 months in South Korea, Lee Jae-myung actually pivoted to present himself as more of a centrist, a pragmatist.
And tell us about the gender issue. I mean, the divide seems really about as stark as anywhere in the world. Why are South Korean men and women diverging so much in terms of their political affiliations?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, across the world, we're seeing a gender divide. And particularly, it's pronounced among younger Koreans, right? This is a story that we're seeing in Europe, we're certainly seeing in the United States, but it's so far apart in the South Korean case. And we can see that in this election, we can see this in the previous election. In fact, the previous election is, I think, what fomented a lot of these to the national stage.
So explain the gender divide in Korea to me, because you have, I mean the social conditions that lead to it. So you have women in Korea who often, when I've gone there and you read about, who talk about a very conservative patriarchal society which is still very reluctant to, empower or liberate women. But now you have a male backlash to whatever efforts were made to empower women. So, you know, what are the drivers on each end?
Yeah, I think there's two levels to this. Like you mentioned, there is a social or cultural dimension. Family-based mores are still really strong in South Korea, and strong gender lines are part of that, right? The second factor that I think is really the strongest one that's causing this to be a tipping point is the economics of having a family and the difficulty of finding work. The workplace is really hard to have work-life balance. And so that's making women delay getting married, delay having childbirth. And then that's not really fitting into the traditional timeline for having families. And that's bubbling over to how men feel they're not able to keep up to the timeline that they want to have their families either. So I think that that's at the core of this, but it's become such a big political issue that it's kind of taken on a life of its own.
So let me ask you finally, you know, we look from the outside at Korea, and it's a huge success story. There are very few countries in the world that have gone from developing country status to developed. And Korea has made that, you know, if you think about it, it's basically like Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. That's, you know, a very small number. Everybody else gets stuck in the middle income trap. So it looks like South Korea is successful. What does all this tell you about that picture that we should understand?
So I think about Korea in comparative perspective a lot. And I think social changes that happened on the ground in Europe, in North America, things that took 3 generations, happened in less than a generation in South Korea. And so that's putting a lot of pressure on society to come up with changes that it's just maybe not ready for. Cultural changes are slow, right? Even if economic changes can be fast. So social changes are slow, political changes are slow, institutional changes are slow. And so it's really a lot of these things are what's happening everywhere. It just happens at a much faster pace in South Korea. So I think that helps explain some of these things. And it also means that Korea can kind of be a bellwether for what's going on in other places. So we need to be watching what South Korea does to grapple with these sorts of things in order to adapt elsewhere around the world as well.
That's fascinating. The downside of rapid success